1 West 72nd Street. 9 stories. Yellow brick and brownstone. Gabled roofs. A Gothic gatehouse fronting Central Park West. On the night of December 8, 1980. The temperature in Manhattan hovers just above freezing. A man in a heavy coat stands inside the building's archway. He has been waiting for hours. In his pocket, a .38 caliber revolver. In his hands, a paperback copy of The Catcher in the Rye. At 10:50 p.m., a black limousine pulls to the curb. The building behind him has stood at this address for 96 years. It has held the wealthiest residence in New York. It has been designated a National Historic Landmark. And in the next 90 seconds, it will become the most photographed murder scene of the 20th century. In 1880, the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue, what would later be renamed Central Park West, was largely empty. Goats grazed on the surrounding lots. Squatter shacks dotted the rocky outcroppings. The Upper West Side was Manhattan's frontier, an unfashionable district of farmland, breweries, and unfinished promises. The wealthy of New York lived along 5th Avenue below 59th Street. To build a luxury residence this far north was, by every measure of the period, eccentric. The man who decided to build it was Edward Severin Clark. Clark had inherited a fortune. His grandfather, also named Edward Clark, had partnered with Isaac Singer in 1851 to commercialize the sewing machine. By the 1870s, the Singer Manufacturing Company was the largest sewing machine producer on Earth, and the Clark family was among the wealthiest in America. In the late 1870s, Clark commissioned architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg, a young designer who would later create the Plaza Hotel and the original Waldorf Astoria, to design something New York had never seen. At the time, apartment living in America was associated with poverty. Tenement buildings housed immigrants in cramped, multi-family quarters. The American upper class lived in row houses and freestanding mansions. The very idea of a respectable family choosing to live in a shared building was, in 1880, faintly scandalous. Clark wanted to change that. Construction began in October 1880 and continued for more than 3 years. The site covered nearly an entire city block. Hardenberg designed the building in a German Renaissance style, with elements borrowed from medieval Saxony, French Gothic, and English Tudor. The yellow Nova Scotia sandstone and brick rose 9 stories. There were gables, niches, balconies, terracotta panels, a central courtyard, 2 interior carriageways wide enough for horses. Inside, the building contained 65 apartments. No 2 were alike. Some had as few as 4 rooms. Others had as many as 20. Ceilings rose to 14 feet. Floors were inlaid with mahogany, oak, and cherry. Fireplaces, dozens of them, were imported from England, Italy, and France. The building included a private dining room for residents, a refrigerated wine vault, a generator producing its own electricity, and one of the earliest residential elevators in New York City. The cost of construction reached approximately $1 million, equivalent to more than $30 million today. The building opened on October 27, 1884. By that date, the founder was already dead. Edward Clark had passed away in 1882, 2 years before completion. The building was finished under the supervision of his estate. There is a popular story, repeated in newspapers, novels, and tour guides for over a century, about how the building got its name. The story claims that critics joked the address was so far from the center of New York, it might as well have been built in the Dakota Territory. Historians have debated the truth of this. Some argue Clark simply admired Western place names. The carving above the main entrance, a Native American figure in profile, suggests the name was chosen deliberately and possibly long before construction began. But the nickname stuck, the Dakota. For most of its first 80 years, the Dakota was a residence, exclusive, expensive, but not yet famous. That began to change in the 1960s. By then, the building had been converted from a rental property into a cooperative. Shares were sold rather than apartments. Each prospective resident had to be approved by the building's co-op board, a small group of existing tenants empowered to accept or reject any applicant for any reason or for no stated reason at all. Lauren Bacall moved into a 9th-floor apartment in 1961. She would live in the building for the rest of her life, more than half a century. She raised her children there and died in the same apartment in 2014. Leonard Bernstein, the conductor and composer of West Side Story, took an apartment on the 7th floor. Boris Karloff, known for his portrayal of Frankenstein's monster, lived there until his death in 1969. Long after, residents would claim to see him in the hallways. Judy Garland, in the final years of her life, kept a residence there. The dancer, Rudolf Nureyev, eventually purchased multiple apartments. Roberta Flack, who recorded Killing Me Softly with his song while living there, moved into the building in the 1970s and remained for more than 50 years. The Dakota became, in a precise and literal sense, a vertical village of celebrities. In 1967, director Roman Polanski began filming Rosemary's Baby, based on Ira Levin's novel about a young woman who comes to believe her unborn child is the offspring of the devil. The novel used a fictional apartment building called the Bramford. Polanski wanted something real, gothic, foreboding, faintly European. Exterior shots filmed in the spring and summer of 1967 showed Mia Farrow walking up to the gatehouse, entering the courtyard, looking up at the gables. The interiors were filmed elsewhere, but the building itself became, in the eyes of millions, a place where something wrong lived. The film was released in June 1968. It became one of the most influential horror films ever made. After Rosemary's Baby, the Dakota carried an aura. In 1973, John Lennon and Yoko Ono purchased their first apartment in the building. Lennon was 33. The Beatles had broken up 3 years earlier. They were recognized everywhere, photographed constantly, followed by fans. They wanted privacy. The Dakota's gatehouse, its doormen, its central courtyard, offered distance from the street. Over the following years, Lennon and Ono acquired additional apartments inside the building, eventually owning multiple units across several floors. Their primary residence faced the corner of Central Park West and 72nd Street. Below that apartment was the building's main entrance. Below that, the gatehouse archway. And just beyond the archway, on the public sidewalk, was the spot where, on the evening of December 8, 1980, a young man from Hawaii had been waiting for most of the day. His name was Mark David Chapman. He was 25 years old. He had flown to New York from Honolulu several weeks earlier, returned home, then flown back again. In his hotel room, he reread The Catcher in the Rye and made notes in the margins. On the morning of December 8, 1980, Chapman left his hotel and walked to the Dakota. He stood near the building's entrance. Around 5 in the afternoon, John Lennon and Yoko Ono emerged. They were heading to a recording session. As Lennon passed, Chapman held out a copy of Double Fantasy. Lennon stopped. He signed it. Chapman remained outside the Dakota. For the next 5.5 hours, he waited. He spoke briefly with the doorman, Jose Perdomo. Witnesses later described him as polite, soft-spoken, unremarkable. In his coat pocket was a Charter Arms .38 caliber revolver. Loaded with 5 hollow-point bullets, at approximately 10:50 in the evening, a black limousine pulled up to the curb on 72nd Street. Yoko Ono stepped out first. She walked past Chapman without seeing him and entered the archway. Lennon followed a few steps behind her. He was carrying tapes from the recording session. As Lennon passed, Chapman called out, "Mr. Lennon." Lennon turned slightly. Chapman dropped into a combat stance and fired 5 times. Lennon staggered up the steps into the vestibule of the building's front office. "I'm shot! I'm shot!" Then he collapsed. Yoko Ono ran to him. Chapman set the revolver on the ground. He removed his coat to show he had no other weapons. Then he opened The Catcher in the Rye and began to read. The first police officers arrived within minutes. Officers took Chapman into custody without resistance. A second pair of officers lifted Lennon and carried him to their patrol car. They drove him to Roosevelt Hospital, less than 10 blocks south. Lennon was pronounced dead at 11:15 p.m. The news was broken on live television by Howard Cosell during a Monday Night Football broadcast, less than 30 minutes later. Within hours, a crowd had gathered outside the Dakota. By morning, the crowd had grown to thousands. Candles burned along the sidewalk. Flowers piled against the gatehouse wall. Songs were sung by people who had never met. A vigil began that, in symbolic form, has never quite ended. Mark David Chapman was charged with second-degree murder. In June 1981, he pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He has been denied parole more than a dozen times. Yoko Ono remained inside the Dakota. She has never moved out. In the years following Lennon's death, the Dakota became something it had never been before. It became a destination. Tourists arrived daily, first from across the United States, then from Europe, Japan, Latin America. They photographed the gatehouse where the shooting had occurred. They left flowers, notes, drawings of doves, pressed cigarettes, broken guitar strings. The doormen, polite and efficient, allowed brief visits and discouraged longer ones. The residents of the building, who had purchased apartments precisely for privacy, found themselves living above a permanent informal memorial. In October 1985, a more formal site was dedicated. Across the street, inside Central Park, a triangular section of land was renamed Strawberry Fields. At the center, a circular black and white mosaic was installed, inscribed in its tiles, a single word: Imagine. The co-op board, already known for its selectivity, became famously stringent. Over the following decades, the board reportedly rejected applications from a string of well-known applicants: Madonna, Antonio Banderas, Cher, Billy Joel, Connie Chung. The board's stated reasons, when any are given, tend to involve concerns about noise, paparazzi, security, or building stability. The unstated calculation is widely understood to involve avoiding the kind of public attention that, on one December night in 1980, the building learned to fear. Yoko Ono, now in her 90s, remains the Dakota's most prominent resident. According to property records, she has owned multiple apartments in the building over the decades, several combined into a sprawling private residence on the 7th floor. Her son, Sean Lennon, has also held an apartment in the building. Apartments at the Dakota now sell for sums that would have been unimaginable when Edward Clark broke ground in 1880. Recent transactions have ranged from several $1 million for smaller units to figures well in excess of $20 million for the largest. The building was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972 and designated a National Historic Landmark in 1976. Its facade is protected by city preservation law. The gatehouse, the courtyard, the dormers, the original wrought iron, all remain essentially as Henry Hardenberg drew them more than a century and a half ago. The doormen are still there. The carriageway is still there. The spot on the sidewalk where Mark David Chapman fired 5 shots is still there, unmarked. No plaque, just grey pavement, leading to an archway, leading to a courtyard. The residents have decided, quietly, through more than 4 decades of co-op votes and closed meetings, that the address itself will not be rebranded by the worst night in its history. Across the street, in Strawberry Fields, the mosaic still spells the word. Visitors still come. The building still stands. What does an address remember? The Dakota has stood at 1 West 72nd Street for 142 years. It has outlived its builder. It has held the residences of conductors, ballet dancers, film stars, novelists, and a Beatle. And it has, in the most literal sense, witnessed. A building cannot speak. Deed records and tax filings do not feel. The terracotta panels above the gatehouse do not know whose blood passed beneath them on a December night in 1980. But the address remembers in the only way an address can. It remains. It outlasts. It collects quietly the lives of those who chose to live behind its yellow brick and Gothic gables, and the lives of those who chose, for whatever reason, to wait outside. Edward Clark wanted to prove that wealthy Americans would live in apartments. He proved more than that. He proved that a single point of ground, given enough time, can hold an entire century of fame, secrecy, art, and violence, and that the gate to such a building is never just a gate. If this episode held your attention, subscribe to Praedion. We are building, address by address, a forensic history of the United States. Next on Praedion, a 15-room mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, where 4 generations of one family controlled a fortune that shaped American politics. The Dakota stands and waits.